The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So now China is testing a self-sufficient space station, and the idea is to create sort of like a closed ecosystem in a sense that will provide everything that human beings need to survive. And similarly to what we've seen in the US in terms of possible psychological experiments as well as scientific experiments for what the trip to Mars might be like. And there have been these test environments created that are at least supposedly cut off from the rest of the world, oftentimes simulating the delays that would be experienced with communication with Earth during a potential trip to Mars. 4 students at Beijing University, at the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, entered into what is called Lunar Palace 1 yesterday. And the idea is to stay in there living completely self-sufficiently for 200 days. And as far as they're saying, Pat, they're happy to be sort of like human guinea pigs for this test, and that it's maybe a step closer to being astronauts, although it's pretty unlikely that these specific people would be the ones that actually end up living on this hypothetical future space station.
That's exactly it. Now, I can see you wanting to volunteer yourself to go up to space or maybe be the first person on Mars.
Yeah.
But to take part in an experiment where you have to be in solitude for 200 days, and then you don't even get the benefits of being the one to explore afterwards. I mean, how do you find people to sign up for that?
Yeah, you're basically saying, we want to test on you what might be the worst parts of space travel and isolation, but you're not actually going to be doing the really cool stuff, which is the space travel that you're sort of being a guinea pig for. I don't know. I don't know if and what they're being paid. I assume they're being paid. I don't know what. Sure. Although, you know, one can never be too sure exactly what the financial arrangements are currently in China. And this is, but there's broader stories here. I mean, number one, China being a bigger and bigger player in many areas geopolitically. We talked about China as a major polluter, but also as one of the countries making the most amount of progress when it comes to curbing pollution, and now wanting to make a more serious play at the space race. Although China has participated, of course, in space exploration, they are a bigger and bigger player here.
And maybe this has to do with the fact that we're taking more of a globalist approach when it comes to space exploration. But I wouldn't care so much if China was the country that first got people on Mars as compared to if the United States was to do it or if Russia was to do it. I mean, they are far behind because we've been doing this sort of thing since the 50s and 60s. So it would be surprising if they beat us up there. But I wouldn't care so much if they were to do it. Whoever gets there first, if it's in the next 10, 20 years, that'd be fantastic.
Oh, sure. With peace and love, whoever gets there. However, they do plan to go back to the moon. And that's one of those things that in the U.S. has been sort of controversial. And I don't mean controversial in the sense that some people don't believe we ever went to the moon. I'm not talking about that conspiracy theory. I mean that there have been sort of multiple camps on whether we should try to go back to the moon. In other words, we've done it already. Are we really going to learn anything from going back to the moon when now it appears as though Mars is the next step on the horizon? I believe we would gain a lot from going to the moon, because if you consider how much technology has changed from when we went to the moon, the amount that we could learn now, I guess what I'm trying to say is we could test technology by going back to the moon now, which we know we can do, right? It's a way simpler thing because of the distance than going to Mars. We could test actual technology that might be used in going to Mars or elsewhere that just wasn't available for the testing when we went to the moon.
Oh, I certainly think it's worthwhile, especially because I think the end game isn't just to necessarily go there. It's also perhaps to set up some sort of colony or settlement up there in the future, especially because we're unsure about the certainty of our own planet, if it's even going to be habitable in the next hundreds or 1,000 years.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
the idea is to branch out a little bit more.
I don't think the moon, if we've got to leave Earth for those reasons, I wouldn't go to the moon, which is a satellite of Earth. I mean, again, I think it would be valuable for testing technology if we were to do that, but I don't think that the moon is going to be our eventual home. I mean, it's tiny and it's subject to a lot of the same issues that our planet will be ultimately when the sun explodes.
It's certainly not the same thing as saying, well, I've already vacationed in San Francisco, so why would I want to go back? You know, I mean, there's extra things that you can do there.
Completely agree. Couldn't agree more. So anyway, China wanting to and seemingly taking steps to become a bigger player in space exploration. Okay, Pat, I don't know if you're aware of this, but a couple years ago, former producer Lewis once sort of offhandedly said that because of the terminal velocity of a bullet falling from the sky, that it's really not dangerous to shoot rounds into the air. And of course, within minutes of the publication of that episode of the David Pakman Show, he was absolutely crushed by people who both have a passing understanding of physics and just people who know how to use the internet to Google things. And he ended up having to retract that statement. I wouldn't say in shame, but certainly in a situation that I think he admits he would rather have avoided, or something along those lines.
It actually reminds me of that myth that a penny being thrown off the Empire State Building could kill someone. Now, Mythbusters tested that and found out that wasn't the case. I think it would hurt, but not necessarily kill you.
And I think if I recall correctly, a lot of the issue was, if you imagine a flat penny, if you can imagine it falling straight down without toppling at all, that it could achieve a much higher velocity than the way it would fall, which is it would really be tumbling, and the drag would prevent it from actually accelerating that much. Lewis applied that same idea to a bullet. And as we know, as we now researched and found out, you actually can be killed by bullets that just fly up into the sky. And indeed, that has happened. It's been about a week since someone was hit in the head with a bullet that just fell out of the sky. This was a 13-year-old kid in Hammond, Indiana, who died as per the announcement of the Hammond Police Department. And what they say is this kid was playing outside, playing basketball with a bunch of other kids in the evening on July 1st when he fell. It was immediately unclear what had happened. Some people who were playing with him thought, oh, he seems to be having a seizure. They called for an ambulance. And it turns out that he was hit by a falling bullet. And the bullet was part of, it wasn't like a targeted attack gone wrong. This was a celebratory pre-4th of July celebration that police believe led to the firing of rounds into the air. And now someone is dead.
I mean, the timing of it seems pretty obvious right before the July 4th celebration. So that's why you can, you maybe can't find out who exactly did it, but you know the reason why they were doing it. I guess back in January 1st, right after New Year's, a lawmaker in Texas was injured pretty severely after the same thing happened to him. Now, luckily, he survived, but there was a very risky medical procedure that he had to take to get that bullet out of his head. Not pretty.
No, not pretty, and completely irresponsible, and this it's just such stupid behavior. And again, if you're a good guy with a gun, you'd think one of the main sort of rules you would understand is you don't fire the weapon into the air. You fire the weapon at a shooting range or in self-defense, or I'm guessing if you also want to go out and commit murder or something like that. But the point is, you don't just release stray rounds into the air, and this is exactly what happened here, and what will ultimately happen with the individual or individuals who were involved in that, it's not totally clear right now, but just tragic. I mean, it's just such I don't want to say this to devalue other ways that people die, but it's like a particularly senseless way to be injured by someone's sheer stupidity.
Yeah, so incredibly random, too. I mean, this whole talking point that guns don't kill people, people kill people, or, you know, this whole good guy with the gun thing, it seems to just eliminate the possibility that accidents can happen and that these weapons can malfunction. So, you know, there's not always intent when someone's shot by a gun. Sometimes the gun will just automatically discharge, or people don't realize that it's loaded or what have you. We did a bonus show story last week about a YouTuber who held a book in front of her boyfriend and shot through the book thinking that the book would stop it with all the pages in it, and it went right through the book and killed him. Yeah,
and you're, I think, also referencing that interview we did with Arthur Bryant about the Remington firearms, which were firing spontaneously. The concept of an accident is, legally speaking, questionable, as we've talked about before. I mean, basically, with the exception of a firearm that, through its faulty nature, as in the Remington story, fires spontaneously, you're basically talking about a negligent discharge of a firearm, right? If you don't think it's loaded and it is, and you accidentally fire it, we can colloquially call it an accident. But from a legal perspective, that is a negligent discharge. That is a discharge of a firearm that was not intended and that took place because of an error made by the individual. And that's what a lot of people also don't understand. That anytime we hear about these accidental shootings, hey, listen, it was just an accident. Well, it was the negligent discharging of a firearm to which which the gun owner presumably was responsible for.
And in that Remington gun scandal case, it wasn't necessarily the people that were misfiring the weapons because they would just happen on their own.
Yeah.
And so in that case, the negligence comes from the gun manufacturer itself, and they were just paying settlements so they wouldn't have to actually address the problem and fix their weapons.
Minority problem, though. I mean, for the most part, anytime a gun fires and it's a, quote, accident, it is because of negligent use by the person who was handling it. The Remington story is a disaster. But most of the time you hear about accidental shootings, it's not a spontaneously firing gun. That
seems like there's no chance we could ever find out who this guy was because he was probably, you know, I don't know, a mile away.
Could be a mile away, or maybe, you know, if it's a handgun, maybe not. But yeah, I don't know if we will ever find him. So there is some good news in the labor market. We talked on the regular show today about the continued effort from Republicans to lower the minimum wage. I know you're thinking, wait, we should be raising the minimum wage, not lowering it. Well, no, in a number of states, Republicans have successfully lowered the minimum wage over the last six months or so. The labor market had a good month in June. We have our jobs numbers from June. Didn't get to this on the regular show, but did want to talk about it. 222,000 new jobs in June. The unemployment rate went up slightly from 4.3% to 4.4%, but that is because more people joined the labor force to look for work. And this is a key thing that is often not known about the way the unemployment system works in the U.S.
Yep.
If you stop looking for work, you are no longer considered unemployed from the point of view of the unemployment rate. If you start looking for work, because the economy improves maybe, you are now considered unemployed until you find a job. This is no secret in the sense that this is the way unemployment numbers have worked for decades in the United States. And I continue to find it funny, although at this point, this has been superseded by so many other absurdities from the Trump administration. The same numbers, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers that under Barack Obama were not trustworthy. It wasn't clear if they weren't trustworthy because Obama personally doctored them, or because the people running the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the time were partisan shills or whatever. The same numbers that were not trustworthy during the significant economic growth under Barack Obama are now the numbers that the Trump administration is pointing to as evidence of what a great job they're doing.
And you'd think the White House would be able to come up with some reason as to why they're now trustworthy numbers. Maybe something changed in the data. But Sean Spicer, a few months back when there was similarly good numbers coming out, just openly said, oh, yeah, the president didn't believe those numbers then, and now he believes them.
Period.
That's it.
How does that even count as an explanation? But interestingly enough, in 2017, presidential politics, that, I guess, is an explanation, which is really weird. And the bigger picture here is that we are very likely to be heading towards, well, not very likely. We are getting one day closer every day to the next recession. We don't know when it will be, but eventually there will be some kind of recession. And we're seeing a number of indicators now that are not particularly confidence inspiring. Now, I'm not doing this as a sort of economic prediction, right? I think that by and large, and by the way, I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in economics. I think by and large, economic predictions from economists are broadly speaking bogus in terms of what's going to happen. But from a big picture, whenever you have peaks, you end up having valleys. The valleys ideally are higher and higher valleys, and we've had bigger picture economic growth, but we are seeing a stock market, which again is not the indicator of the economy, but we are seeing a stock market that has been growing, and it is arguably quite overvalued right now. You are starting to see currency issues with the US dollar. You are starting to see indicators within the housing industry that are starting to approximate some of what we were seeing before the 2008 crash. And there are lots of people, and Pat, you're sort of in this camp, really anybody who's graduated college within the last, I guess, 8 or even closer to 10 years, they've basically been working, investing to the extent that they're investing, working with investments. If they work in finance, for example, they've basically been in a paradigm where their entire working career has been during a time of growth, where no matter what people invest in, no matter what industry you're in, minus some industries that have been shrinking, coal comes to mind, things have just been pretty good. Okay. And there's a lot of people who think, hey, I understand. You're in it for the long haul. I'm not going to panic when there's a downturn. But when we see a 10, 15% correction in the stock market, when we see unemployment maybe trickle back up from the low 4s to maybe 6, 7, or 8, and it's a very, very different dynamic, I believe you are going to start to see a significant part of the population panic, because it's been so long that the economy has been growing. Doesn't mean everybody's doing great. We have a serious poverty issue, which we'll talk about later on in the week. I think that there's a lot of people who just aren't going to know how do you manage an economy that's not good from a day-to-day perspective.
It's interesting that you bring up that recent graduates point, because I remember during the recession, a lot of students would go right for a master's degree, stay in school because the jobs weren't really out there.
Right.
And the people that graduated, say, 5 years later, it was a lot harder for them to compete because they just weren't as qualified.
Sure. Yeah. And they were delaying job experience in order to obtain more education. And then they were at a deficit in job experience. And this sort of gets us back to this vicious cycle of, hey, we want to hire people with experience, but there's no way for people to start getting that experience unless someone hires them without the experience. And that's more of a micro issue in specific industries that a lot of college graduates are contending with. Needless to say, I don't know when this recession is going to happen, but eventually there will be a downturn, and that's going to be an eye-opening experience for a lot of people.
Sure, that's just the natural fluctuation of things, you could say, especially because we've had 7 years of a relatively strong economy at this point, which is pretty surprising looking back. But one more negative point from these job numbers was that wages only increased 2.5%, despite the fact that so many jobs are being added. The unemployment rate is looking pretty good. The stock market's up. I mean, 2.5%, that's not even keeping up with inflation.
That's right. But to be fair, when this was happening under Obama, I had this exact same perspective, and I think it's important to be even-handed on this. Wages have been stagnant for basically 40 years, real wages. And this is more of a systemic problem that goes well beyond Donald Trump and President Obama. Think whatever you want about their respective economic policies. This is a broader issue that we'll actually be talking about with economist Tyler Cowen, I believe, next week. I'm really looking forward to speaking with him. All right, that's it for the bonus show today. Talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.